Okay. Social distancing, of course.
Okay. All right. Go ahead. I'll take time.
Okay. I was planning on going forward this week, going further in Das Tunas, but there was something that was so important last week. I think we should go over it a little more because we kind of just read it very fast, and that's usually what we do. The very important things we usually do too quickly, and we don't talk about it enough. So if you notice at the very beginning of Das Tunas, he says, if you remember, Das Tunas is a conversation between the soul and the intellect, and one of the first things that the soul says is Hine Kol Ha'Ikarm Hayud Gimel Hine Hemu Masum Etzli B'Lishum Safek Klal. The 13 principles of faith, which were elucidated by the Rambam, he says it is obvious to me that these things are true. However, he just has a question that he doesn't understand some of them. So, this is first of all, we see a few things here. One, to the Ramchal, that the 13 principles of faith were obvious to him, right? That there was no debate whether the 13 principles of faith were accurate or not, but these were something that was accepted amongst the Jewish people. And two, we see the proper response, the proper way that if someone has an issue, how do they approach it? If someone has an issue in Judaism, we ask a question, and that's what the neshama is doing. Right? In the Jewish religion, we believe that you're allowed to ask questions. In fact, this is something Rabbi Vishnevsky used to always say, we're supposed to ask questions. We don't believe that we're supposed to blindly follow something. We're supposed to ask questions and investigate. And that's what the neshama here in the Sefer is doing. He says, I believe in the 13 principles of faith, but there's certain aspects I don't understand. I don't understand Hashgacha and Tchias HaMeisim and Mashiach, and he wants those Tzchar V'Onesh, reward and punishment. He wants those things to be explained. And that's the proper way. What we don't do is we say, I have a question on this, so it must not be true. Because anytime we're approaching Judaism, we have to realize that, we have to be humble. That the Jewish religion has been around for a long time. We have a Masorah, we have a tradition all the way back from Sinai, and there were very, very big rabbis before us that knew everything, and they're coming down to us and relating to us these principles and various laws and halachas that they have. Thank you for shutting the door. I appreciate it. That we have, and if we have an issue, if we think we have a question, so we ask a question and we try to get an answer. We don't say that this is not true. Now, since we're talking about the 13 principles of faith, and we're saying how important they are, what are they? So let's see what they are. If you want, on page 178 and 179 in the Art Scroll Siddur, they're summarized. So we're obviously not going to go into them in depth right now because that would take a long time. But if anyone's interested, more than happy to give a shiur about it or learn with anybody where they came from. Now, what's important to know is that the Rambam didn't just invent these principles on his own. He didn't take them out of thin air. In Judaism, like I was mentioning, we have a Masorah, we have a tradition from Sinai, and what the Rambam is doing, where's he getting this information if he didn't invent it? He's getting it from the Talmud. He's getting it from the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, all of the previous works that came before. And where did those works come from? Were they just written down by the sages of their time, the nice ideas that they had? No, of course not. These were ideas that were passed down from God to Moshe Rabbeinu and to the Jewish people at the giving of the Torah, which we will soon be celebrating on Shavuos. And that's where these ideas come from. So the Rambam didn't invent these ideas out of thin air, God forbid. He is calling them from the oral tradition and the oral Torah. Now, what are they? Number one is that God is the cause of everything. He created everything. Number two is that He is unique. He is one. Number three, He's not physical. Nothing physical about Him. He doesn't have a body. Chas v'shalom. Number four, He is eternal. Number five, that we only pray to God. We don't pray to anyone else, any other being. Number six, all the words of the prophets are true. Number seven, the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu is different than all of the other prophets. Now that's important because Moshe Rabbeinu was the one through whom the Torah was given. So we'll see, this is something we discussed in Derech Hashem. While the other prophets saw their images, saw their prophecy through messages and different visions, Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to God like we're speaking now, like a person speaks to his friend. Number eight is that the Torah that we have now is the same Torah that was given to Moshe at Sinai. Number nine is that the Torah will never be changed. Number 10 is that God knows everything. Number 11, that there's reward and punishment. Number 12 is that Mashiach will come, and number 13 is that God will resurrect the dead. So those were the 13 principles. Again, that was very quick, but if we want to have another class or something and go over them at another point, more than happy to do that. Now, there are those that ask, why did the Rambam have to list these 13 principles? Right? Don't you have to believe everything in the Torah is true? So what's unique about these 13 principles? So there's a famous Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who's a very famous chiddush here, a novel idea, that there's something called Nebuch and Apikaris. Meaning, if a person doesn't believe, usually we say in Judaism, if a person doesn't know, right, if he's an honest, he's beyond his control, he didn't know certain things, he never put on tefillin because he grew up in the desert, and he never knew what tefillin are, so it was beyond his control, he couldn't put on tefillin. So we say that, he didn't know any better, so he didn't put on tefillin, he doesn't get punished for it. But however, when it comes to these 13 principles, even someone who was never taught, he can't get into the next world, because these are the basis of being a Jew. Believing in these 13 things are the basis of being a Jew. And even if it was a person beyond a person's control, he doesn't get into the next world, even if he didn't know it because of ignorance. It's called Nebuch and Apikaris. Now, Reb Chaim's Chiddush, there's a lot to discuss there if we hold like it, but that's how, just to give a sense of how important these 13 principles are, that's what Reb Chaim says. Now, okay. So that is about the importance of the 13 principles. And part of the reason I'm bringing this up now is, like I mentioned before, when you have an issue or you have a question on something in the Gemara, how do you treat it? So there's a pasuk, it says, Ki yesharim darchei Hashem tzadikim yelchu bam uposhim yikashlu bam. The words of Hashem are straight, and the righteous go in them, and the wicked, they trip up in them, they falter in them. There's two ways to react to something. One is when you have a question, you say, hey, this is... I don't know how this works out, what the Rambam says works out with this Gemara. Perhaps there's a question on it. So how do you do it? So you try to a tzaddik will try to find an answer. He'll go to his rebbe, he'll go to his rabbi, and he'll ask someone who's more knowledgeable than him, because he knows. We all know that I don't think. Well, many of us, many in this room are very big Torah scholars. I think even the biggest Torah scholars in this room know they haven't mastered the entire Talmud and all of the commentaries, so they say, let me go to someone who's more knowledgeable and try to figure out. And we see that's the path that Torah scholars throughout the generations have taken. They say, let me look and try to find an answer. That's what a tzaddik does. What does a paisheya do? What does someone who is not following the right path do? He says, the Rambam here doesn't seem to fit with what I believe, so the Rambam must be wrong, right? The Rambam must not be accurate, his 13 principles must not be true, and therefore I can reject him. And unfortunately, there's a fellow, Marc Shapiro, he's a professor, and this is what he did in a very arrogant way. He says, plain and simple, the Rambam's wrong. And unfortunately, this book has become accepted a little bit in certain areas of Judaism with people who call themselves Orthodox. And unfortunately, people that don't know much, they follow him. What's interesting is I took some time looking through part of his book, and you realize that the sources that he quotes to, quote-unquote, question the Rambam are ridiculous. They're misquotes, they're misrepresentations, and I'm not the only one. There's a scholar from Jerusalem, Rabbi Herschel Grossman, who actually wrote a very long article in Dialogue. I have it online. I can email it to anyone if they're interested, where he shows that where he shows all of the mistakes and all of the misquotes that this professor, Marc Shapiro made in his book. So unfortunately, this person has misled a lot of people, and even people who call themselves rabbis subscribe to this opinion of Marc Shapiro. So I would just recommend that if anyone has, you shouldn't learn from such a person, from such a rabbi who subscribes to the views of this Marc Shapiro and says that you don't have to believe in the Rambam's 13 Ikrim and the 13 things were wrong, because that is the not accepted Jewish path. And we see here the Ramchal, the first thing the Ramchal says in Derech Hashem, the Ramchal is accepted amongst all of Judaism, and the first thing he says is, obviously I believe in the 13 principles of faith. So it's utterly ridiculous that a modern scholar could come along and say that they are wrong. And if you look, what's very interesting is they'll take a Gemara, right, and they'll say, the Rambam is against this Gemara. Now, what's obvious to any student of Talmud is that the Rambam knew every single Gemara well. Now, when you're reading the Gemara, you think that the Rambam is ignoring a Gemara. What it really means is that the Rambam had a different interpretation of the Gemara than you do, and he knew exactly what it was saying. He was well aware of that Gemara. If you look in the Rambam's writings, you see his total mastery of all of the Talmud and all of the biblical writings and all of the oral Torah. There is absolutely no way that he missed the Gemara. We have sages that are alive now that wouldn't miss a Gemara. So for sure the Rambam, who lived 800, 900 years ago would not make such an elementary mistake. You know, just to give you an example of a mistake this fellow Marc Shapiro made, he writes that Rashi, there's a Rashi that implies that he believed God had a body, right? Except what he doesn't realize, what he totally missed, is that Rashi in another place says that God does not have a body. And this is an obvious thing, that God does not have a body, and something that we have to believe. So I just thought we would talk about that and not go on today, because this is something that is obvious to the Ramchal, that the Rambam's 13 principles of faith are obvious to every Jew, and those that say not, it's coming from a place of ignorance, and unfortunately they don't know any better, and perhaps they're in the categories of the, what Reb Chaim says, Nebuch and Apikaris, they don't know any better, but still, someone who preaches the wrong views, even if they're a very nice person, and even if they mean well, you still shouldn't learn from them because they're teaching the wrong views. I guess we'll stop here. We didn't really go on today, but if anyone has any questions or comments, more than happy to discuss this further. Okay,
I started reading through the article.